In our previous lesson, we learned about the three essential parts of an argument. Now that we have a better understanding of those parts, we can better challenge those arguments that we disagree with by pointing out specific weaknesses. But before we go any further, let's go ahead and pause this video for a reflection. This time, watch a video on necessary and sufficient conditions. Then look back at your notes from the previous lesson to respond to the question that you're given. When you're finished with your reflection, go ahead and unpause the video to continue the lesson. Let's take some notes. When you evaluate the strength of an argument, you should look at each of its three essential parts individually. Consider whether the claim can be made based on the evidence given. Consider whether the evidence is true, and consider whether the assumption is true. We're going to look at examples of what arguments look like that feature each of these kinds of weaknesses. Weaknesses where the claim is disconnected from the evidence, weaknesses where the evidence is debatable or incorrect, and weaknesses where the assumption is flawed. Let's begin with disconnected claims, which are found when the evidence given doesn't actually support the claim that is made. For example, if I were to make this argument that the United States used to be a nation of law and order, this is why ex-felons should not be allowed to vote. My claim here is that ex-felons should not be allowed to vote, or ex-felons equals should not be allowed to vote. And my evidence is that the United States used to be a nation of law and order, or United States equals used to be a nation of law and order. My assumption, though, is really difficult to pin down because I don't have any matching terms. Now, in a previous lesson, we talked about how when you don't have matching terms, you have to rephrase your claim or evidence or both so that they do have matching terms. But that's not really something we can do here. This argument features a disconnected claim because the terms in the evidence statement don't match with any of the terms in the claim. And we can't paraphrase either of those statements to have matching terms without changing the meaning of one of those statements. So in this case, the evidence statement and the claim statement are just too divorced from one another conceptually to really make sense. This particular kind of argument weakness usually occurs when the writer skips some steps in their reasoning process. Getting from this evidence statement to this claim statement requires that additional arguments be made in between. But as it's written, it doesn't actually make sense. It should be noted here that this kind of argument weakness isn't very common, at least in texts written by serious writers. And that's because when broken down, the problem is pretty easy to spot. Most writers who make this error either haven't thought their argument through critically enough, or they're trying to be manipulative, or both. Also, be careful that when you identify this kind of weakness, be careful that the missing logical steps aren't actually discussed just elsewhere in the text, because if that's the case, then maybe the argument isn't as weak as it would appear to be. Next, let's look at debatable or incorrect evidence, which is found when the evidence given is disputed or inaccurate. Such as in this argument here, that ex-felons should not be allowed to vote as they do not deserve the full rights of citizenship. Such as with this argument here, that ex-felons should not be allowed to vote as they do not deserve the full rights of citizenship. Our claim is that ex-felons should not be allowed to vote, and our evidence is that ex-felons do not deserve the full rights of citizenship. Our assumption is going to be something like should not be allowed to vote equals do not deserve the full rights of citizenship. A bunch of different ways we could phrase this, but I came up with denying someone of the right to vote denies them of their full rights to citizenship, which that makes sense. That is a logically clear thing to say. The problem here, though, is in the evidence. This argument features evidence that is debatable because it's not widely agreed upon that ex-felons do not deserve full rights. After all, don't we often say that prison is designed to rehabilitate offenders so they can one day rejoin society as productive law-abiding citizens? So why shouldn't that come with the rights that everyone else enjoys? This kind of weak argument is more common than disconnected claims. Whenever you have debatable evidence, it's often going to be something that's based on an ideological or philosophical opinion. Whenever you have incorrect evidence, it's often going to be something that is misleading rather than outright false, or it could be something that is just a commonly held misconception. Finally, let's look at flawed assumptions, which are found when the unspoken assumption doesn't make sense or is questionable. Such as in this argument here that says, every ex-felon committed a serious crime. They have demonstrated that their judgment cannot be trusted and therefore should not be allowed to vote. For this particular argument, don't let that first sentence fool you. It's just a definition of what a felony is. The real argument comes after that first sentence, with the claim being ex-felons should not be allowed to vote, and the evidence being that ex-felons have demonstrated that their judgment cannot be trusted. So the assumption would have to link the two terms together: should not be allowed to vote equals have demonstrated that their judgment cannot be trusted, or anyone who has demonstrated that their judgment cannot be trusted should not be allowed to vote. This argument features a flawed assumption because it is absurd to deny voting rights to everyone who has had a lapse in judgment. For one, people can change. For another, those lapses in judgment may not have anything to do with their ability or inability to choose leaders who will help our society. And most importantly, a democratic society doesn't get to pick and choose who gets to participate in governance and who doesn't. That is a very slippery slope. When we start trying to judge who is capable of making choices and deny people rights to vote based on that, that gets into a whole sticky situation, and that isn't real democracy anymore. This is by far the most common kind of weakness that you'll find in arguments, and for reasons that should be pretty clear. The flawed part is the unspoken part. So since it's not spoken, the weakness isn't immediately apparent. It's easy to fall for these weak arguments as well, since again, the stated parts are often true. It's the unspoken parts where the weakness or untruth lies. All right, let's go ahead and pause the video to complete our first exercise. This time you're going to be practice identifying the weaknesses found in some simple arguments. When you're finished with the exercise, go ahead and unpause the video so we can go over what you did. All right, let's take a look at number one. The federal government does not need to provide free tertiary education to people since people already have access to tertiary education now. Our claim here is that tertiary education does not need to be provided by the government. Our evidence is that tertiary education is something people have access to. Our assumption here being that the government does not need to provide things that people have access to. This argument features a flawed assumption because there are a great many things that people, quote, have access to that the government must still ensure they actually have, because having access to something and actually having that thing are not the same. For instance, everyone has access to private primary and secondary schools. Yeah, everyone has the rights, the access to send their kids to a private elementary or private middle or high school. But not everyone can afford to do that. Okay, so this is why the government provides free public primary and secondary schools to all its citizens. Number two, if tertiary education were made free to the public, then the quality of education received at those schools would decline. Therefore, the federal government should not provide free tertiary education. Our claim here is that free tertiary education should not be provided by the federal government. Our evidence is that free tertiary education would reduce the quality of that education. Our assumption here is that the federal government should not provide a service that would reduce the quality of that service. This argument features debatable evidence because just because something is funded publicly, meaning by the government, rather than privately, does not necessarily mean it will be of lower quality. Yeah, for instance, the federal government passed the GI Bill way back in the 1940s to give veterans free tertiary education. The government started giving Pell Grants in the 1970s to give free tertiary education to the poor. And since it's done those things, the quality of college education has not declined. Number three, public services are paid for by everyone via tax dollars. Making tertiary education free would only benefit some people, however. So it's unfair for the federal government to tax everyone to pay for it. Our claim here is that it's unfair for the federal government to tax everyone to pay for free tertiary education. Our evidence is that free tertiary education would only benefit some people. And our assumption here is that it is unfair for the federal government to tax everyone to pay for services that only benefit some people. This argument actually features both incorrect evidence and a flawed assumption. The evidence is incorrect because saying that free tertiary education would only benefit some people and not all people is really short-sighted. Yeah, having more educated people in your society benefits society as a whole. So everyone would be benefited if more people had higher education. The assumption is flawed because arguing an assumption that publicly funded services are only fair if they benefit everyone in the exact same way, well, that's naive. For instance, our national parks really only benefit the fraction of the population who visit them every year. But few people would argue that it's unfair that the government spends everyone's tax dollars to preserve those. Let's go ahead and pause the video again for another exercise. This time you're going to practice identifying the weaknesses found in extended arguments. When you're finished with the exercise, make sure you unpause the video so we can go over your responses together. There are a lot of weak arguments that you could find in this rough draft. It is, after all, a rough draft, and so it needs some refinement before it can be any kind of good piece of writing. I chose to show you guys three weak arguments that really jumped out to me, however. And this is the first one. Compelling people to vote is just in a democratic society because it is relatively less intrusive to personal freedoms than other compulsory duties. And that's one of the very first arguments made there in paragraph 1. Our claim here is that compulsory voting is just in a democratic society. Our evidence is that compulsory voting is relatively less intrusive to personal freedoms than other compulsory duties. And that means our assumption is going to be something like the justness of an action in a democratic society is determined by how intrusive it is to personal freedoms. This particular argument features debatable evidence. Yeah, saying that that voting is relatively less intrusive to personal freedoms than other compulsory duties, that's debatable because our current voting procedures in this country require individuals to spend a great deal of time and energy to vote. The act of voting, much less the preparation to vote, getting registered, making sure that your registration isn't somehow magically deleted before the election, making sure that you know the exact polling location that you're allowed to go to, all of that stuff, much less the actual act of voting, it's at best an inconvenience and at worst a huge hassle. And that is actually a big reason why so many Americans currently don't or can't vote. Here's another argument that I found that's weak. Number 2, people will concern themselves more with the consequences of voting because they are compelled to vote. And that's an argument made in paragraph 2. Our claim here is that people will concern themselves more with the consequences of voting, and our evidence is that because people will be compelled to vote. The assumption here being that compelling people to do something causes them to be more concerned with its consequences. Yeah, this argument clearly features a flawed assumption because forcing people to do something doesn't make them automatically care more about that thing. Yeah, people must be convinced to care about something. They must have reasons to care about something. You can't make someone care under the threat of punishment. And finally, number three, this comes from the end, the last paragraph. Compulsory voting has been successfully implemented in other countries because Australia's compulsory voting system contains uncomplicated legal consequences for people who do not vote without sufficient reason. Our claim here is that compulsory voting has been successfully implemented in other countries, and our evidence is that compulsory voting in Australia, they've created this system of uncomplicated legal consequences for people who do not vote without sufficient reason. Our assumption then is something like this. Successful implementation of a system is determined by how complex the legal consequences for offenders is. That took me a little while to get, and it's because the argument, in addition to being weak, is actually kind of poorly written. It skips several logical steps. Here, however, I went ahead to say that this argument features a very subtle but significant flaw in its assumption. And it all has to do with the meaning of the phrase, quote, successful implementation. Since the entire essay is arguing why the US ought to enact compulsory voting, the only way that this Australia example would make any sense at all is if it provided an example of another country that had enacted compulsory voting and had achieved favorable results. So that's what one would expect the phrase successful implementation to mean in the claim, that Australia achieved favorable results. But that's not at all what the evidence talks about. The evidence only talks about how Australia has created a streamlined legal process for punishing people who don't vote. That's not success, is it? I mean, I guess in some way. Yeah, so the creation of a streamlined system of punishment, yeah, that's one way, I guess, to define a successful implementation, but few people would ever argue that it is a meaningful way of determining the success of such a program. Wouldn't real success be better defined by achieving the desired results, which are making our elections more representative of the population of a whole? All right, let's go and move on to that last practice activity there. You're going to practice identifying weaknesses within some arguments in the wild by examining some common arguments that are made pertaining to an issue of your choice. Yeah, complete this practice activity, and when you're done with the activity, you are finished with this lesson.